But I'd go for a run, and I'd try to run about 3 miles. And I always noticed that in that 3-mile run, 3.5-mile run, what would happen is there were parts where I felt good, and then there were parts where I felt terrible. And so I learned that, I have to get through these terrible parts to get to the better parts. So I just had to keep going. I just tell myself, one more step. And it's amazing how you can grow your stamina. A number of years ago, this is probably 15 years ago, 16 years ago, I heard about this book. I think it was called Marathon Man or something like that. I don't remember, but it was this guy who was a businessman, and he was on a business trip some day, and he was kind of out of shape, and he was kind of unhappy with his life. And one night, something happened in him. There was adrenaline or something, so he decided he's just going to go for a run. And he went out for the very first time in his life, and he ran like 8 miles. And then he said from that point, he started to run more, and he became an ultra marathon runner. Welcome, everybody, to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I am Dr. Douglas Peak, and I am your Salty Pastor. If you're just joining us, just thought you'd know real quick, I have a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Bible. I have a Master's in Christian education, and I have a Doctorate of Ministry degree. I've been in the full-time ministry since 1987. And I did some part-time ministry while I was in college before that. Now, I, in the Salty Pastor Podcast, primarily focus on biblical understanding. And I do that by digging into, first and foremost, the arguments that Paul or one of the other authors of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, were making. So it's very important to understand logic and rhetoric, because these guys understood that in the way they wrote and the propositional truths that they laid out. So we kind of look at, how are arguments constructed? How do they flow? And what are the conclusions that they make significant and important? So we kind of focus on that part of biblical accuracy. We also focus on the philosophical construct, because we want to understand what those people were thinking and feeling when they heard these truths, because that gives us a lot of insight. And then third, we look at history. What was the cultural norms? How does the words and the verses or verbiage, that they used influence the flavor and tone of what they were trying to communicate? Now, why do we do that? Well, we do that because what we're doing is trying to coach you up in your faith and give you the tools to coach your own faith. We want you to develop critical thinking skills, so that you can think for yourself. We're not here to tell you what to think. We want to focus on how you think. And that is, how do I know that this is exactly what the Lord said in the Gospels? Or how do I know that the Apostle Peter meant these things? And when you kind of dig into it at that level, the scripture and what happened in this time frame just comes to life. And it doesn't just come to life from way back then, it comes to life to you right now. And you see then at that point why it is considered life-changing truth. And so that's what we're about. We're about coaching you up in the way to think that gives you clarity about your life. It helps you know where you're going and how you're going to get there. It helps you understand your purpose, where your meaning in life actually comes from. It clarifies your core values by knowing what you believe and why you believe it. We live in a crazy world where we hear all kinds of crazy stuff all the time. And one of the most important things is learning how to navigate it, because we live in a world that wants to influence you. It wants to influence you at all these different levels. It wants to influence you at a consumer level, like buy this product or get involved in this thing or enjoy this music or eat this type of food. And so there's all of these arguments and marketing happening out there to appeal to you on a consumer level. But it's also important to understand is that we live in a political world. And so people are trying to get you to buy into their political position or their political whatever you want to call it. And so there's a lot of influence happening there. The media has an agenda, and it just seems like there's constant different agendas. And you have to learn to navigate that, because it's going to impact your life. So This week on the Salty Pastor Podcast, we've been focusing on perseverance, because if you're going to navigate life, there's one thing you got to have, and that is perseverance. Now, we talked about Romans chapter 5 and where perseverance, kind of get a definition of it on Tuesday. On Tuesday, we talked about Romans chapter 8 and about perseverance, where that perseverance comes from. And then 2 Peter 1 and kind of perseverance and how it works. So if you really want to dig into the kind of the biblical definition of perseverance, go back and listen to Tuesday's podcast. Now, what I'd like to do is, before we get into the practical application, I want to go to Matthew chapter 10. And I want to talk a little bit about something Jesus told his disciples when he sent them out to do kingdom work. Okay, and it starts with verse 16. And it says this: Jesus was speaking. "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. And you shall even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not become anxious about how or what you will speak, for it shall be given you in that hour what you are to speak. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. And brother will deliver up brother to death, a father his child. Children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You'll be hated by all on account of my name." And then here he says the most important: "But it is the one who has persevered to the end who will be saved. Now, whenever they persecute you, flee to the next city. For I say to you, you should not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes." So it's really kind of interesting where he's talking about this notion that you're going to go out, you're going to live in the world, and you're going to be persecuted, or you're going to suffer, or you're going to have trials and tribulations. And he says this: "It is the one who endures to the end who will be saved." So I think what I'd like to do now is just spend the rest of the podcast having observations about perseverance, okay? And I want to start with a video clip of Tammy Duckworth, I think her name is. She wrote a book called Grit. And she did a study to realize that it's not necessarily IQ, and it's not necessarily looks or personality or even emotional EQ that gives you the greatest amount of success in life. She says it's about perseverance. And she calls that perseverance, that tenacity to keep going no matter what. She calls it grit. And so I want you to hear what she has to say. So let's listen.
My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies, asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years.
Isn't that an interesting perspective of how she was just basically identifying, the very nature of perseverance? So I want to talk about perseverance in some of its qualities so that you can just, in a real practical way, apply it to your own life. I think one of the things about perseverance that's so important is I think that oftentimes we feel like it's an act of will. And so we wonder if we're strong enough to persevere, when in reality, I think perseverance is more of a perspective, right? It's kind of like a focus as opposed to an active will. And what I mean by that is you see your life as a marathon and not a sprint. So you have more of a long-term perspective of your life as opposed to a more short-term perspective. In James chapter 1, verse 12, James writes, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." And so it's kind of this principle of the perspective is that what I suffer right now is momentary compared to the promise of God. And we see this same exact theme in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 4. So I'd like to just flip over there real quick and read it to you, because it's interesting to me how he articulates perseverance. He goes, first of all, he talks about perspective, all right? And he basically says, we have been given, verse 1 of chapter 4, we've been given a ministry. Therefore, this ministry that we've received, which is a ministry of mercy, he says, we do not lose heart. So losing heart is the Bible's way of saying we give up. We fall into despair. We don't endure any longer. And then he says this, he goes, we have a treasure, and that means something so valuable, in jars of clay or earthen vessels, meaning our physical bodies, he says, and the treasure we have is that the surpassing greatness of the power comes from God and not from ourselves. So the power to endure can come from God and not ourselves. Well, how do we get that power? It's through perspective. He goes, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, never destroyed. We always carry about in our body the death of Jesus, or the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our bodies. And then you jump down to verse 17. He goes, look, our momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. So we must look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So that's all about perspective. So power to survive, power to endure, power to persevere comes when we focus our perspective on eternity as opposed to the immediate, which is very, very difficult. And it's very difficult to do, when you're suffering tremendously. One of the things that I've learned through my wife's ordeal is what chronic, severe pain can do to a person. And it's just amazing to me how strong she is. And her strength comes from the fact that, pain tends to make us focus very narrowly and inwardly because you're trying to do anything to get it to stop. But the way you overcome is and have hope is you have to look up and look beyond, right? And think about things that allow you to endure that. And so perseverance is a perspective. I remember I've said this before, but it's always been a favorite kind of a quote for me. It's not a specific quote. It's more of my paraphrase of Dr. Peter Kreeft's point. And he says that people who are the most heavenly minded, meaning their perspective is heaven and eternity, tend to be people who not only accomplish the most in this world, but enjoy this world this most because they have endurance and perseverance. And so see how your perspective has such a powerful impact on your strength to persevere under trial. And James says that once you're approved, you receive the promise. And so I thought that was interesting. The second thing that I think that Tammy Duckworth said that I thought was interesting is perseverance when coupled with passion, right? Passion and perseverance, she said, is what allows you to achieve long-term goals. And I would take that further, and I would say that it's perseverance coupled with your passion of what you're focused on, your perspective, is how you achieve character building. Not just achieve a long-term goal, but you're actually achieving character. You're achieving the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding of how that's called character, of how these goals come about. And so your focus is in the process, right, of persevering towards the thing I'm passionate about, knowing God or loving my family or a great marriage. You want these things. And so, but you have to persevere through difficult times to experience those things. Now, if you have a perspective like, well, for instance, I'm married, and you're thinking to yourself, man, we're having a rough spot right now. I just don't know if this person is the one. I don't know if this person can do it. I don't know if we'll ever figure this out. There's no way. There's no hope. Well, what's your perspective? Your perspective is, I'll be happier somewhere else. But remember the study that I quoted to you? They found that people who were in really, really difficult times in their marriages, they went back, 5-10 years later, and they found that those who got divorced were just as unhappy 5 years after their divorce as prior to their divorce, and those who stuck with it were doing much better, which is a sign that perseverance does something in you, right? It gives you a gift that grows your character and allows you to understand, oh, these are the patterns of success, all right? So I think that's a pretty significant thing to realize, is that perseverance, when coupled with passion, is how you achieve character building and long-term goals. So my question then becomes, what's your passion? See, that's why it's important to know what you believe and why you believe it. It's what knowing your purpose is all about. It's about, this is the thing I'm passionate because this is what gives my life meaning. This is what I'm focused on. And when you couple that with perseverance, boy, that's when you'll see true life development, life transformation, all that kind of stuff, okay? And that leads you to the next thing. And I thought, she used the word stamina. And so that got me to thinking, I was going, what does that really mean, stamina? Well, perseverance is all about stamina. And that is simply the ability to keep going. One of the things, years and years ago, I used to run a lot. Now I can't run anymore because, my joints won't handle it, I guess. But doctor said, no more running for you. So I do a lot of walking and hiking and weightlifting and stuff like that to try to stay in shape. But back then when I was running, one thing that I had to learn is that running was good for me regardless of how I felt. And sometimes I would run and I just feel great, right? And then other times I would run and I just feel terrible. But it was a discipline of running that made the benefit. So you had to have stamina during those times when you're running and you just don't feel well, right? I mean, it would seem to me I'd go out and run. I think back then, boy, that was back in Wichita. That was a long time ago for me, over 30 years ago. But I'd go for a run and I'd try to run about 3 miles. And I always noticed that in that 3-mile run, 3.5-mile run, what would happen is there were parts where I felt good and then there were parts where I felt terrible. And so I learned that, I have to get through these terrible parts to get to the better parts. And so I just had to keep going. I just tell myself one more step. And it's amazing how you can grow your stamina. A number of years ago, this is probably 15 years ago, 16 years ago, I heard about this book. I think it was called Marathon Man or something like that. I don't remember, but it was this guy who was a businessman, and he was on a business trip some day, and he was kind of out of shape, and he was kind of unhappy with his life. And one night something happened in him. There was adrenaline or something. So he decided he's just going to go for a run. And he went out for the very first time in his life and he ran like 8 miles. And then he said from that point, he started to run more, and he became an ultra marathon runner. And so he started to run on a regular basis. And then within a few months, he entered a marathon race, and he ran that race and finished it. And then he thought it wasn't enough. So then what he did, I kid you not, he entered 2 marathons in one day. He ran 2 marathons in one day. And then he got into these 100-mile endurance races, and he started running those. And I mean, the story of this guy is absolutely amazing of how far he could push his body and the distances that he could run. Just imagine trying to run 100 miles nonstop. That's just That's phenomenal to me. I just can't even believe that people can do that. And so yet he was doing that. And in essence, what happened is he was growing his stamina. It's like, well, you can do more. And that's what stamina does. I believe that illustration I told on Tuesday about the sailors is that the young sailors would give up and drown before the boat would show during World War II, but it was the salty old sailors that had more stamina. They didn't have as much strength as the young sailors, but they had stamina. So they had hope and they could survive longer in the water. And that is a critical point, is that stamina is linked to your hope. And hope comes from believing things that are not seen often. So I just think that is a really interesting connection. Think about that in your own life. What is your hope? I mean, and is your hope that things are going to be okay? Is your hope that you can get beyond it? Is there hope that that God has a plan and a future in your life? Is there a hope that once approved, after the suffering, you will receive the promise of God? So hope is an interesting thing because it has to do with perspective, and it also influences your stamina. All right. But that's why I think we have to go to that final point, and is that hope is ultimately the point of perseverance. You see, perseverance produces hope. We studied that on Tuesday, right? But hope increases your perseverance. So they work in tandem with one another. She said in her video in particular, she said, grit is sticking with your future, not just for the day, not just for the month, but for the years. And I think that's a really big deal. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, it says this: therefore, since we also have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance or perseverance the race that is set before us. Now, does he mean an actual race, a foot race there in early first century Rome in the Olympics or something? No, he's saying that there is a spiritual race that we are running, and it has been set before us, right? And he goes, okay, so what is the goal? What is the finish line of this race? Well, he tells us in verse 2, looking only at Jesus, the author and perfecter of the faith, who for the joy set before him endured or persevered the suffering of the cross. He despised its shame, but then he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So notice what he's talking about there is that this is all about hope. He said he had hope in what he was going to accomplish. He knew what his suffering and death would produce for mankind, and how it was the greatest act of love that God could ever commit as his example to all the rest of us. So that was his joy, that was his hope, and that gave him the ability to endure the cross, endure the suffering, despising the shame. But what it did is it allowed him to walk in the fullness of the joy of what he brought about, because he persevered. And so we can persevere if we look at two things. Number one, Jesus and only Jesus, right? And number two, the witnesses that have already achieved the goal. We look back at the saints of old, the great men and women of faith of old, and we see how their faith sustained them even during the most difficult times of their life, and how ultimately it ended up doing what? Letting them receive the promise, the crown of righteousness. And that's what you and I can have if we attempt to persevere. So if you're in a situation right now where you're single and you're thinking to yourself, you're never going to find love, you're never going to be happy, you're never going to be these things, persevere. Just persevere and develop stamina to keep following Jesus one day at a time. Maybe you're in a situation where your child is just not doing well. Your child is struggling. Maybe you have a prodigal child. Maybe you and your child aren't connecting. Just remember perseverance, perseverance. If your faith is going through a dry spell, perseverance is the key. Maybe you're in a situation where you have a conflict in your marriage and you don't know how to solve it, or a family member, or at work in the church politics, and it's just crazy. Maybe even at your church, there's a conflict. It's like, what do you do? Because sometimes these things, like in your marriage, it's so painful. Sometimes with family members or even work or churches, it's so painful. What do you do? Well, perseverance is key to what? Going through and seeing the hope and experiencing the hope on the other side. But you have to understand the hope of the outcome in order to persevere through the suffering. What if you're in a physical suffering now? What if your body is just not cooperating, or it's betrayed you, or you have health issues? And persevere. Just persevere. What if you're being persecuted at work for your faith, or in your community because of your faith? Well, keep the hope above you and persevere. In the end, perseverance produces a result. And I want to flip over to the book of James real quick, because I just want to point this out. And I hope it gives you, hope, or it just shows you that even though it's difficult, there is a promise. And it goes like this. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter temptations or trials, knowing that your faith, when it's tested, produces endurance," or steadfastness, perseverance. "Let this endurance have a perfect result," or a perfect work, "that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing." So even if you don't understand what's going to happen on the other side, even if you don't know where it's going to end up, I think one of the things you can say is this: by going through this, I'm going to be a more mature person. As I go through this, once I come out, my faith will be stronger. As I go through this, if I keep my eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of my faith, I will know him better. I will know how he leads me. I will know how he works in my life like never before. So my encouragement to you is, whatever challenge you're facing in life, we all are facing challenges, what I would do is encourage you to focus on not answering the question, why is this happening to me? Or why, God, are these people doing this? Or why, God, is this turning out this way? I would focus on, God, how do I endure? How do I persevere towards the good thing that you have for me in this? God, I can't do this forever, so I need to rely on your strength to pull me through. God, I can't suffer like this forever, but I know you're with me in every moment and you can pull me through. And it's the hope of what this is doing in my life right now. It is the hope of how my faith is going to be strengthened and clarified and purified. It is the hope that Jesus never leaves me or forsakes me that allows me to endure the trial that I'm going through. So I hope this helps you. I hope it's something that really impacts your life in a way, because these are the issues and the things that God has revealed to us in the scriptures. And if we understand them, they can have a dramatic change in our life. So I just want to say, I hope this week focusing on perseverance has helped you. These things always help me. My wife says sometimes, I guess you're preaching to yourself. I go, well, preaching and teaching, that sometimes is the best way to minister to your soul. And so I encourage you to try to share what you've learned with other people. And if you want to use this podcast to do it, share it with them and say, hey, let's get together and talk about this and read these verses together and see if there's something we can add to the conversation. Because in the end, remember, I'm here to help you develop the skills to grow your own faith. I want to coach you in your own faith. I'm not saying to you, just do what I think or do what I do. I want you to do the work yourself so that you walk in the fullness of that blessing. So if you are encouraged or you're ministered to by the Salty Pastor podcast, why don't you go over to our YouTube channel, look up the Salty Pastor, and then give us a like and subscribe. That is a big deal. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star or however they do it. There's Spotify and other areas in which you can listen to this podcast, whatever kind of app or program that you use to listen to podcasts. If they have a way to rate it, rate it. Just let us know that you're involved. So I'm glad that you are here. I'm glad that you can also go to our website as well, and you can look at old podcast episodes. You can do a search and you can look up by theme. You can look up by passage of scripture that we've studied. And so go back and listen to those old ones, and they might be helpful as well, because we do this to help you. Also, if you go to that website, you can donate directly to the Salty Pastor. You can go on there, click on there, and it runs through, and it comes to the Salty Pastor to help expand this ministry. So I just want to say thank you so much for being a part of the Salty Pastor podcast, and I hope that it allows you to just have a deeper walk with the Lord. You grow your own critical thinking skills. You know what you believe and why you believe it, and in the end, you can say, I'm a person that always thinks for myself.